connected to all of our technology here. Make sure I get my notes as you are joining. If you're joining us for the first time, I invite you to maybe share your name in the chat and also what lesson you may be working on. Okay. I feel like my tech is all over the place today. All right. Okay, so this should be letting people in. All right. So, well, welcome everybody. I am excited to be popping in here with you today doing a live stream. And we're going to be exploring some topics today, a few questions today that I think are going to be fun to dive into. If you are joining me for the first time, so once a month I pop in to do live stream Q&A to answer questions for students inside of my learning community. We share it sometimes with the larger platform, but the questions are prioritized for those that invest in themselves and invest in my programs. So I do have a little summary of the questions that I want to try to get to today. And hopefully we'll get to most of them. There were a lot of questions this month, so I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. And for those that we don't get to in this hour, we'll try to cover at a later date. So some of the questions we're going to be talking about today: why does surrendering look like, or what does surrendering look like for someone who has spent a lifetime feeling overly responsible for other people's well-being? Should you stay with someone if they're not working on themselves? How do we control the emotional influence of others on our state of well-being, particularly a partner or a spouse? What are your best tips for healthy communication? How can you stay secure when you want to work on a difficult relationship, but your partner is ambivalent about it? What are some tips for an anxious avoidant couple who've decided that they do want to work it out? And how do you best honor the part of you that wants a relationship, but you know that it's best not to have one just yet? So definitely some deep questions going on today. So I'm going to try to address them as thoroughly and as concisely as possible. The way this works is I usually will address them in the order in which they are received, and then I will create moments of rest between each topic to address some of the questions that those of you who are joining me live might be willing to offer in your experience. So, first question I'm going to tackle today: what does surrendering look like for someone who has spent a lifetime feeling overly responsible for somebody else's well-being? Okay, not an easy one, but I do know it's one that a lot of my audience members can relate to. So I'm going to share the entirety of the question. What does surrendering look like for someone who has spent a lifetime feeling overly responsible for someone else's well-being? I'd like to learn how to not associate the concept of supporting others with fixing things for them. While I struggle with being patient in general, I think I've improved with asking others what they need instead of immediately jumping in to help. Watching a loved one struggle or suffer is very hard for me. It's easier to help them rather than sit back and wait. I've found that I'm spinning my wheels and doing too much without getting anywhere with the fixing things for others pattern. Honestly, though, surrendering seems more painful, and in some ways I feel like I'm waiting around to see if someone needs my help. It's like I put my life on hold just to be available for people, but it's such a silly thing to do. Even as I'm writing this, I feel like a hypocrite because I like to do things for myself and I struggle to accept help, but then I expect others to want my help or to need me. I am making incremental changes, but I would love some further clarity. If you can describe what's going on and what my higher self would say, that would be great. Connecting this to the chakras would also be amazing. Okay. So we have a lot of information here and a very specific request for the response, and I'm going to try to accommodate this as much as I can. So the pursuit of surrendering the role of being overly responsible for somebody else's well-being, especially when it has shaped a lifetime, is really a profound journey, and it's one of self-discovery and ultimately identity transformation, right? So for a lot of people, the role of the fixer or the caretaker It functions as both armor and as a protective armor, as well as a kind of strength badge that we wear, because it defines our identity and because it affects our relationships in multifaceted ways. So the question here really illuminates the depth of that challenge when we are on a quest to be liberated from it, right? When we want to express ourselves more authentically and maybe hang up the hat of being the caretaker or the fixer or the people pleaser, okay? So in this particular segment, we're going to break down this question into several, I think, important components. And I'm going to try to address them as concisely as I can. So the first component is, how do I stop associating being a fixer or a caretaker with supporting people, right? Can I be a supportive person without being a fixer or a caretaker? And so this involves understanding how the identity, I should say, of the fixer has helped us in the past, how we need to celebrate it, and then how we need now to integrate it in a more adaptive way. The second thing we're going to talk about is understanding how to decode 3 types of empathy and how that's going to help you recognize what is yours and what is someone else's, so that you can create better energetic boundaries. Okay. Thirdly, we want to recognize why it's hard to receive when we are such big givers. And there are 3 major underlying limiting beliefs that we have to acknowledge here before we can do that. And lastly, this inquirer requested an understanding of how the body experiences these dilemmas by conceptualizing healing through the chakra system, which I think is delightful. I love talking about those things. So we're going to talk about that as well. So if you stick with me until the end of this segment, you will learn how to unearth the roots of the fixer or the caretaker role in your life, recognizing both the strengths and the limitations it brings, so that you can have a clearer path towards growth and development. You will discover how to decode and differentiate 3 types of empathy, which is going to allow you to show up more authentically to your relationships and also feel more what I call soul-centered and secure in those relationships. We're also going to delve into the complexities of why is it difficult to receive when we are such big givers. And we're going to talk about some strategies to balance the underlying beliefs that we have around that. Okay. And this is intended to reduce feelings of exhaustion and burnout, right? And then we're also going to learn how to conceptualize and heal the manifestations of those patterns through the chakra system and aligning the body and the spirit in a more holistic perspective and transformative process. Okay. And of course, the goal here is to move beyond the limitations of old patterns, in this case, the fix-it pattern, right? So that we can embrace a new paradigm of support that is not equivalent to burning yourself out, people pleasing, or giving too much, which inevitably leads to a degree of inauthenticity. Okay. So that you can feel, we're doing this so that you can feel more liberated, more powerful, and more sovereignly seated in your autonomous self. Okay, and that's going to improve your relationships tenfold. So for those of you, I see a few more people have joined us. For those of you joining me for the first time, my name is Brianna McWilliam. I'm a licensed and board certified creative arts therapist with more than 15 years in the field, helping adults struggling with insecure attachment styles accomplish what I call soul-centered security. And this is aligning your attachment relationships to the essence of your spirit, to the transcendent self, as opposed to temporary conditions in your life and in your contexts. Okay. So we're going to be talking about this a lot more through the framework of spirituality, because it is a shift in the way that I've spoken about these things before. So I look forward to diving into these topics with you here today. And we do these calls once a month again, usually on the 3rd Thursday of the month. So I invite you back. For those of you that are existing students of mine, you will find the replay for this call inside your student dashboard. If you're watching this publicly or through one of my social media platforms, you may see the replay recording on the dash until we take it down. Okay, so let's just dive into the first topic. So number 1, how do we stop associating being a fixer or a caretaker with the idea of supporting someone, right? How can we disconnect this idea that I have to be a fixer or a caretaker in order to support someone? So I want to just restate this aspect of the question. While I struggle with being patient in general, I think I've improved by asking others what they need before I jump in to help. Watching a loved one struggle or suffer is really hard for me, and it's easier to help than to sit back and watch. Okay. So why is that? Well, it's usually because this is really more about your discomfort with difficult feelings than it is about theirs, right? So that kind of qualifies what I call a fix-it empath in their mental and emotional experience. So to change that circumstance is to get increasingly comfortable with your own uncomfortable feelings. So it's not about them, it's actually more about you. I'm going to explain that in a minute. The other part of this question, I found that I'm spinning my wheels and doing too much without getting anywhere with the fixing things for others pattern. Sure. So fixing things is a tremendous strength, right? Being a problem solver, being someone who can step in and take action, being someone who can shift things in the material world and in someone else's experience, change the conditions to improve someone else's experience. These are tremendous gifts. And it's likely that you have that capacity because somewhere along the line in your experience, there was a parent who modeled it for you, or there was a necessity to step into that role because there was an absence of those things in your life. Okay. And so there was a model for understanding that this is how you demonstrate agency, value, and you earn the love that you receive while justifying your right to have it, justifying your right to be there. Okay. Now, honestly, though, so I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. I want to go to the other part of this question. Honestly, though, surrendering feels more painful. In some ways, I feel like I'm waiting around to see if someone needs my help. It's like I put my life on hold to be available for others. Okay. So we need to ask ourselves, why would somebody else's painful feelings be a burden to us? Why can't we just let them have their painful feelings, right? Why can't we just let them have their struggles? Those struggles are serving them in some fashion, and it's a bit grandiose to assume that we understand how it is serving them in the larger context of their life, right? So this indicates that we have some difficulties with what are called enmeshed boundaries, right? Kind of a merged sense of self. We kind of diffusely sort of just blend into the people around us and the people that we care about. And that leads to an over-identification with other people and their identities and what it is that they need and want, okay? So the pain that we feel is usually a younger part that believes that our identity then is tied to being the fixer. Okay. And if we are to let go of being the fixer, then that younger part of you thinks that it will die, literally. So we have to connect to the higher knowing, to the spiritual self, to know that this little death is required and is actually more of an integrative process, or let's say a job reassignment. Okay. And as that part of yourself, we want to ask that part of yourself what it would rather be doing rather than fixing everything for everybody else. Because this part has tremendous strengths. They just need to be reallocated. Okay. It just doesn't realize that you are living in a new context. You're not living the life you were living when that original coping skill and strength was formed. Doesn't mean you have to let go of the skill or the strength. It means you now need to source that skill and strength from a different place, which means that part needs to be informed. And it also needs to be reminded that it needs to adapt to your new circumstance. So this is parts work, really. And we've done some demonstrations of parts work in my community before. You can find examples of that on my YouTube channel. If you have taken the Attachment 101 courses, the last 2 lessons in your courses are parts work. Okay. So really what we want to do is we want to ask that younger part of yourself, what would it rather be doing? What would it like to do if it trusted you not to collapse in the face of difficult feelings? If it trusted you to let people have their feelings too, right? And this part of it, once you make a concerted effort to speak to that part, it will tell you. It will tell you. Okay. Now, the second thing I want to talk about here is understanding the 3 types of empathy. So a couple of the things that this person mentioned about, it's hard for me it's terrible. It's hard for me to be patient and let other people have difficult feelings, right? So I think it's worthwhile here to talk about what are the 3 different types of empathy. So in my work and in my healing framework, and I talk a lot more about this in depth in my Anxious Attachment 101 course, we look at the 3 different types of empathy. And the first one I refer to as diffuse empathy, right? Or the diffuse empath. So this is experienced by someone who feels other people's feelings and energy inside their own body without being able to discern if it is theirs or somebody else's. And that often leads to things like stressful emotional flooding, overwhelm, and what I call emotional leakage. Okay. And so you might be more diffuse if you walk into a room or somebody else walks into a room and suddenly your mood dramatically shifts with no tangible trigger, and you attribute it to something that must just be wrong with you. Or you're talking to someone about something that doesn't appear to be too emotionally charged, but suddenly you're overwhelmed with a very distinct anxiety or sorrow. It leaves you feeling kind of confused or doubting yourself because you don't know how or why you might be feeling that way. You come home from work or from an activity with a lot of people around and you feel so completely depleted, right? You go to bed and you still feel exhausted when you wake up the next morning, and you were probably tossing and turning the whole night because you had some very vivid dreams. Okay, so that's diffuse empathy. And if that sounds familiar, I'd love to know. Just type it in the chat or in the comments there, diffuse empathy, if you can relate to that. Now, the second type of empathy I call fix-it empathy, and this is the one that I think our inquirer may be struggling with. So fix-it empathy is experienced by someone who feels other people's feelings inside their own body, but they know from whom it is sourced. And so that compels them to want to fix it, whatever it is, for the other person, so they don't have to struggle with the other person's feelings anymore. So they often feel a need to do this because they struggle to sift and sort through their own emotions like that. Okay, so you might be more of a fix-it empath or someone with fix-it empathic abilities if you have a knack for seeing past politeness and fake smiles. You know when someone's covering up a deeper issue, and you're kind of like a dog with a bone trying to get them to own up to it, even if they're not ready. Okay, you can read micro expressions, body language, and verbal intonation like nobody's business, and you kind of preemptively sense the way that someone is going to react to something. And that can lead to trying to micromanage a situation to avoid some kind of anticipated conflict. Okay, when someone walks into the room, you may sense how they feel before you regard the way that they want to present themselves to you. And so you usually have a pretty accurate gut feeling about people, and it might drive you a little crazy if they refuse to recognize in themselves what you know is there. Okay, so if that sounds familiar to you, just type fix it, fix it empath in the comments or in the chat there. Now, the third one we're going to talk about is secure empathy. So this is someone who experiences similar things in the sense that they can sense other people's emotions inside their own bodies. They're aware of where those emotions are coming from, but they're able to be present with their own emotions that are called up in response. Okay, so there's actually 2 people's emotions going on right now, and they can sense that differentiation. Okay, and because they realize what's yours and what's mine, they can create boundaries around both emotional experiences. They create boundaries around both sets of data. Okay, so as to be fully present with the other person rather than getting overwhelmed by them or needing to get rid of those feelings by slipping into fix-it mode. Because fix-it mode is another form of dismissal, isn't it? Right? It's a form of disallowance. So you might be more securely empathic if you are sensitive to falsity or inauthenticity in others, but you take it as your cue to redirect your energy and your efforts elsewhere. You don't need to have the last word, and you don't need someone else to validate your rightness or your extrasensory perceptions. You validate that for yourself, right? You might have a similar gift as the fix-it empath in the sense that you can read micro expressions, body language, and verbal intonation very acutely and accurately and perceptively. You might use this knowledge to mitigate the effects of an anticipated conflict, but you're not going to go out of your way to prevent or avoid it because you recognize that conflict might be necessary, okay, in order to accomplish something more important than avoiding uncomfortable feelings, okay? And you're willing to sit with the uncomfortable feelings the conflict creates because you understand the value of that more important thing, okay? Like letting other people be heard, like letting people experience the consequences of their actions, like letting people learn from their mistakes, right? And lastly, you might also have that instant gut feeling about someone, and you might know that they are repressing their true feelings or failing to live up to what you think is their potential. But in your perspective, it doesn't matter if there's a deeper truth. They're not being honest about it, or they're just not ready to acknowledge it for themselves. And so you respect that and you listen when someone shows you who they are, not just tells you. Okay, so that's secure empathy. Now, the third piece here is, why do I struggle to accept help, but I'm willing and wanting to help others? So I want to reference the question again. As I'm writing this, I feel a bit like a hypocrite because I like to do things for myself, but I struggle to accept help. And then I expect others to want my help or to need me. I am making incremental changes, but I'd like some further clarity around this. Okay. So in my healing framework and in my Attachment 101 courses, this describes the emotional archetype of the anxious guard, okay? So guards have an inability to ask for help. They struggle to recognize their own needs, and they typically do not let others in. When they are in need, they have a tendency to give away precisely what it is that they are needing and wanting, okay? And they find a way to kind of limp along without it. Why do they do that? Well, usually because they believe that love is scarce and everything comes at a cost and is a weighted scale, and you have to be of service to get love and approval. And in fact, sometimes you got to give more than you get just to get anything at all. But the problem with getting, especially with guards, is that they don't know how to receive it once they get it, because receiving means that you might become dependent on something that could be taken away. Don't give me a full meal only to tell me that I'll never eat again. And so guards believe that the food is always going to be taken away, so they get used to living off rations. They will prefer it that way. Now, anxious open hearts that have a more guarded way of managing their emotions, okay, they tend to offer connection while internally withholding it. It's a little more subtle, okay? So let's say an open-hearted anxious guard had a hard day at work and then their pet dies. So when asked if they need support, they might downplay their pain and say something like, oh, you know, it's hard, but that's life. I'll get over it in time. It's probably not nearly as tough as the thing that you're going through. Why don't you tell me how I can help you fix your problem? Okay. So it keeps the focus off of their own difficult feelings while ensuring that people still like them for being of service. But it also keeps them from being truly vulnerable. So they wind up becoming emotionally isolated anyway, which a part of them feels is better because it also means that they are safely unexposed. Okay. And that brings us to our 3 unconscious underlying beliefs that we want to make sure that we are aware of and that we are tackling in order to let this part go, to allow ourselves to receive, right? So the first is that assistance robs me of my agency. So someone helping you may feel like they're taking away your agency. And if you have the identity of the fixer and the doer, if someone tries to do it for you, then they are taking away your identity and the only way that you know how to justify your existence. So help is really going to be most unwelcome. Secondly, if I accept help, then it means that I am weak and complaining. Now, at the same time, on the other side of that coin, there will be another younger part that is desperate for someone else to be responsible for everything. They want to be rescued in the way that you rescue others. And this is the part of you that is likely disowned by the fixer, because the fixer part of you is convinced that this other part is a complaining part. It's a victim part. It's a part that is helpless and will never survive or get things done in the real world. And if you let that part express itself, then it would probably push people away with its neediness. Okay. So you don't want to allow that part an inch, because what if it opens up the floodgates and you become too dependent on that help and you don't trust yourself not to do that because you haven't given that part of yourself enough room to grow and evolve over time. Okay. Now, the third thing is, if I become a receiver, then I will lose control and become helpless to affect my circumstances. So giving to others while refusing to receive is also about maintaining power and control in a relationship. If you are the giver, you are the one with the resources. You are the one with the power to give or take away. If you are the receiver, there's a perception of helplessness or powerlessness to affect your circumstances. And so part of the learning here is realizing that there is tremendous power in receiving, in learning how to discern what you choose and what you will reject. And this will help you develop the boundaries that are really required to avoid things like exhaustion and burnout. Okay. And I would also offer, happen to know this inquirer is a young woman, I would offer exploring divine feminine energies and philosophies to help you with the concept of receiving on an energetic level. Now, speaking about the energetic level, this is the last part of this segment when we're going to talk about how to understand these things in terms of energy and the chakra system. So when it comes to our attachment patterns, the first three chakras that evolve in development are usually the most influential and out of balance. So I'm going to address those three in this last part of our video segment here. So the first one is the root chakra, and the root chakra is located in the genital region. The right of the root is to exist, simply to be, and the shadow aspect is fear. So the root chakra is associated with feeling safe and comfortable inside your own body, and it's primarily concerned with survival concerns. Okay. Now, for individuals that have disruptions in the root, they often feel like they have to earn their way because otherwise they don't have a right to literally exist. These individuals tend to have a lot of worthiness issues. They feel like they're a burden to their partners. They're very fearful of being abandoned or rejected because that leads to a shortened survival on the level of the instinctual brain, right? So it's all about comfortability in the body, being able to utilize the body as the first organizer of experience, and how the body starts to organize that emotional energy at a very early age, okay? If that gets disrupted, it's certainly going to lead to attachment, anxiety, and concerns. Then we have the sacral moving up the torso, below the navel, but between the hips. The sacral is, the right of the sacral is to feel, and the shadow aspect is guilt. So the sacral chakra is associated with things like creativity. These are the gifts of the sacral: creativity, emotionality, sexuality, and the ability to abstract and hold opposites and dualities. Okay. So in other words, the sacral informs our ability to withstand conflicting feelings, channel life force energy into various forms of relational connection and attraction, and also be able to conceptualize ambiguities and dualities without needing to split everything into good or bad, black or white thinking, right? It allows us to think abstractly and move beyond concrete absolutes. So healthy evolution of the sacral, it leads directly to healthy boundaries, right? Because boundaries are about yes and no. And once I can define those boundaries with enough clarity, now I can navigate the gray areas with sophistication. So when we have sacral chakra blockages, we often feel like we don't have a right to our feelings. This is the shadow aspect of that, right? And so we look out into the world and we seek others to validate our internal experience, and we're unable to give ourselves permission to just feel what we feel. And very often we struggle with either too loose or too rigid boundaries. Now, if something goes wrong and we can't handle that anxiety, if ambiguous or conflicted feelings emerge, we start to split. And we might believe that either we are inherently bad or the other person is inherently bad and must be the villain. Okay, so there's no gray areas, there's no in between. And so there's no room for people to be both good and bad, for relationships to be meaningful, loving, and mostly good, but still not long lasting or permanent. And so the loudest mouthpiece of the shadow aspect of the sacral is usually your inner critic. Okay. And if you're very hard on yourself, then you know that your sacral needs a little TLC. Okay. Now, the third one that we're going to talk about is the solar plexus. So the solar plexus chakra is located above the navel, right around the rib cage, upper part of the belly. And the right of the solar plexus is to do, to act. It's your agency. Okay, it's associated with ego identity and a sense of mastery and control. It's the ability to take effective action from a soul-aligned and inspired place. Okay. Now, the shadow aspect is shame, imposter syndrome, prioritizing other people's thoughts, opinions, and judgments of you. Okay. So when the solar plexus is in harmony, we are empowered. We have a sense of self-confidence. We are inspired. We're motivated. There's a clarity of purpose. We have a sense of resiliency. We are able to take calculated risks. We are able to own and feel proud of our achievements. We are able to operate from a place of an authentic self where our actions and our decisions are guided by our higher knowing and our inner wisdom. Okay. Now, in contrast, when we have disruptions in the solar plexus, it can lead to constantly feeling inadequate, having an obsession over how other people perceive you, a debilitating fear of failure or being exposed. And it can result in burning ourselves out due to that overwhelming root pressure and survival fears that are probably churning at a higher rate, now being channeled up into the solar plexus. And so now the solar plexus is working overtime, trying to churn and channel that energy because the root is struggling so much, right? And so that can lead to things like aggressiveness or passive aggressiveness, other types of control issues, or chronic fatigue. Okay. So oftentimes, especially if we're struggling with solar plexus blockages, we can get caught in cycles of self-doubt, overanalysis. We struggle to discern what is a gut intuition versus what is anxiety, survival anxiety. It's really hard to tease out those subtleties. Okay. We might seek a lot of external validation, be overly critical of ourselves, and we're sort of afraid to show up as our true selves, believing that it will be judged or shamed. Okay. And so when we are able to heal or balance the solar plexus, we're able to balance assertiveness with vulnerability. Okay. We can embrace our power without falling into ego traps or power plays and power dynamics. Right. And we're able to really more fully reside in a sense of personal mastery and self-worth and value. Okay. So with respect to the question here, it may be that those chakras need a little bit of love and tender care and attention so that you can start to, on the level of the energy body, allow that some movement. And your parts that I mentioned in the first part of this segment, your parts are going to live in that energy, right? Those parts are just a constricted expression of that energy. It's a archetypal expression of that energy. Okay. So I hope that that helps you conceptualize what it is that may be going on for you in this inquiry about why is it that I give so much, but I struggle to surrender and receive. And just to summarize that one more time. So we want to look at how we can stop associating being a fixer or a caretaker with supporting people. And that involves understanding how the identity of the fixer or the caretaker has served you in the past. Secondly, we want to understand how to decode those three types of empathy so you can recognize what is yours and what is somebody else's emotionally and energetically, right? So that you can create healthy boundaries and really be fully present for someone. It involves recognizing why it's hard to receive when we are such big givers, right? And that means that you're likely have a guard archetype for how you organize emotional energy. And there are three major underlying beliefs that you want to acknowledge in order to process that. And lastly, understanding how the body processes these dilemmas on the level of the energy body, particularly with the three first chakras, which is the root, the sacral, and the solar plexus. So if you found that interesting, I would love to see in the chat, or resonate with any of this, I would love to see your comments in the chat or in the comment section. I am going to take a pause just to acknowledge those of you that may be joining me live. Let's see, I think I saw a few comments here on Instagram. Let's see. Okay, and I see some bizarre comments. I don't know what they mean, but okay. We will keep going. Okay. So let's see, our next question. Should you stay with someone if they are not working on themselves? All right, so let's put that in the chat. Should you stay with someone if they are not working on themselves? Okay. So this question, it really reveals a concern that I would say a lot of my clients experience in relationships, and it tends to be rooted in a fear of being with someone who's unwilling, seems unwilling, or kind of unable to grow, and therefore they believe that by being in partnership with them, you're unable to grow. Okay, so I would have anyone who's watching this segment or is just joining us, I'd have you go back and watch the last segment we did where we sifted and sorted through the 3 different types of empathy and understanding how we may be taking on more than is ours, right? Because here there's some muddiness in our understanding about what it means together, to be together, but also separate, right? Interdependent, partnered, but still retaining your individuality as an autonomous being, okay? So the underlying pain is usually a fear of stagnation, an imbalance of power or reciprocity in the relationship, and really longing for mutual growth and sharing, which are all wonderful, you know, desires and delicious things to experience, of course. So usually this problem arises when one partner is committed to self-improvement while the other is kind of indifferent, right? And that can lead to feelings of frustration, loneliness, or even resentment if we're not able to approach it with a certain type of reframe. So just to give you an example of this, we might imagine a scenario where one partner is really into personal development, self-help, they're pursuing new hobbies, they're working on their career, they're focusing on their own spiritual growth, and the other partner seems to either be completely disinterested, disaffected, or sort of digging in their heels, like kind of resisting or resenting even what you might be exploring. And so over time, this emotional gap starts to widen, and it leaves both of you feeling kind of disconnected and discontented with the relationship, right? And that's often because one person is starting to want, value, and prioritize different things. And the partner that you are with is a reflection of who you've been, whom you have been up until this moment. So you're changing, and now you are wanting your partner to change with you, okay? This threatens the original attachment relationship. This threatens the unspoken contract of your relationship that was originally established. So you're mad at them, but really you're the one who's changing the game. You're the one who's switching up the rules. Okay, now, I'm not saying that's good, bad, or indifferent, but realize that their obstinance, the energy of that, you're so annoying with all these newfangled things, I'm going to dig in my heels because I like the way things are, and I'm just going to do everything in my power to keep them the way that they are. And then you kind of respond with this energy, which is like, well, I like these newfangled things and I don't want to change back, and I'm going to dig in my heels and I'm going to keep doing them in the way that I want to do them for as long as I want, because I want things to change in this way. And so you see that this is the same energy being expressed on both sides, okay? So what is the solution? Well, first, practically speaking, the solution is to start with communication. It's really essential to openly and honestly discuss your feelings, needs, and expectations with your partner, particularly if they are changing, right? And that can provide some clarity on why they might be resisting what you're doing, working on themselves, so to speak, and whether they are open to changing or joining you on that journey. And it will become would definitely be a lot more effective conversation if you're able to do it from a place of honesty, a place of deep structured communication, and trying to avoid as much defensive communication or fearful posturing as possible. If you're interested in learning how to do that, I do have a program called Decode Mixed Signals in Relationships, as well. I have a few communication programs, which I can include some links about. But in essence, the first thing you want to do in approaching this is you want to assess your values, because it's likely they've changed. Okay. So you want to take a look at what are our dimensions of compatibility now, our values and priorities. In my healing framework, I call this the 3-step HIP communication formula. We have 12 dimensions of compatibility along which you can measure the compatibility of your relationship. So you want to take a look at those first. Then you want to set up some boundaries, okay? Because those too have likely changed. Boundaries usually alert us to a need. And if your needs have changed, so have your boundaries. So if your partner's lack of growth is affecting you negatively, meaning there's something in their behaviors actually negatively impacting you, it's important to make them aware of it, to be curious. And also, if you want to maintain an air of generosity in the relationship, be curious and create opportunities for them to contribute to your well-being, letting them know how to do that. And I recommend using positive action language for that. But this is crucial because your boundaries, if your values are changing, your needs are changing, so too are your boundaries. Okay. It can be helpful to seek coaching or professional help. Having a buffer in the room can help you with that as well, and figure this out without jumping to the character assassinations that can sometimes happen when our survival fears are kicked up and our attachment anxiety turns on. Okay. And you want to decide what needs the relationship meets for you as an autonomous individual, and consider, if this person is not capable of meeting those new needs that you have, are there other ways that you might consider getting them met in such a way that it preserves the structure of the relationship? So in practically speaking, some long-term couples, for example, open up the relationship. Or it doesn't even have to be that extreme. It could just be that I value intellectual conversations and exploring Tough Mudder competitions, but my partner doesn't like that. So I'm going to do that with my best friend, and my partner is going to be the person that I seek physical comfort with and raise children with. It's about getting into the nitty-gritty of what are the different threads that go into a long-term commitment. So in essence, I would just remind you that every person's growth process is unique. If the relationship is providing love, support, and fulfillment in other ways, then it is probably workable, but you won't know until you get into a very brass tacks, practical, nitty-gritty conversation about it. Okay. And oftentimes that's going to trigger bigger emotional needs and concerns, which stem from early attachment wounds, because you are changing the relationship contract. So you're going to kick up all that early attachment stuff. But because you are changing, the relationship has to change. And at some point, you and your partner will have to decide if they are willing to change with you. Right. So I hope that gave you some things to think about and consider. I'm just going to pause and acknowledge the chat here. How to process or get over betrayal. Hid the new person while going on and off with me for 3 months. Cut me off in the hospital procedure day. I reached out 3 weeks ago as I was scared, and now the person apologized and wants to be friends, and I can't get over how cold the person was. I would not want to be friends with that person. If they were deceitful with you and they exited your life when you were going through a procedure, you should not get over how cold the person was. That's good information. And you're probably not getting over it because there's a very intelligent part of you that says, stop trying to get over this. Stop trying to get over it and stop trying to connect with them because they are not safe. I don't know all the story, but just based on what you told me, they're not safe. So don't get over how cold they are. Recognize how cold they are and let them go. because they're not safe. Okay. I just love that you approach things from the chakra perspective. I've always felt things in this part since childhood before I even heard of the chakra system. Yeah, the chakra system really makes a lot of sense for conceptualizing these things, right? I do have a video on my YouTube channel called How to Get Over Betrayal and Deceit. Actually, Bezam, if you're able to, if you could maybe go to my YouTube channel and just type in the search bar, betrayal or deceit, it will pop up and we can put that link in the chat. Okay, let's see. So let's look at the next question. How do we control emotional influence of others on our own state of well-being, particularly the influence of a partner or spouse? Okay. So I would again reference back to what we just talked about diffuse, fix it, and secure empathy. This is all about emotional energy and how to create appropriate boundaries around emotional energy, right? So, you know, this kind of echoes the struggle that a lot of people face around maintaining their own emotional stability when they are in an intimate relationship. So I think what really underlies this particular question, how do we control the emotional influence of others on our own state of being, is really about a deep longing for autonomy, for a sense of balance while in relationship, for being more self-aware, right? While still wanting to be loving and responsive towards a partner. And those are wonderful aims, right? And so the problem is usually sort of like the unseen power that we might give a partner or a spouse to have over our emotions. And that can kind of manifest in a couple of subtle ways, from influencing our mood to all the way to dictating our self-esteem. Okay. Now, this kind of emotional entanglement can breed a state of constant anxiety or even things like codependency. Okay. So, you know, just imagine being so attuned into your partner's feelings that you tend to just lose sight of your own. It's that diffuse empathy, like you don't know what's yours and you don't know what is somebody else's. And so you're kind of constantly stepping on each other's toes because you're really sort of unsure of your own footing. And so this leads to a disconnection from the essence of your higher self or your spiritual self. And so there's kind of a loss of control and an erosion of your personal resilience in the relationship. So to regain that control, I think it's really important that we shift our attachment security from feeling secure in a relationship with a human being to feeling secure because my primary attachment relationship is to my own spirit and to my own higher power, right? So first you want to recognize and understand what are your emotional triggers, right? And where and how in just your regular daily life does your partner step on them, right? And then you want to realign. So you want to begin to orient your emotional well-being around that sense of inner connection to something higher than yourself, to your own spiritual essence, instead of relying on your partner to set the tone, to dictate to you what you will feel and want, right? And to do that, we engage with transcendent practices that stimulate transcendent experiences so that your soul feels recognized, nourished, and that it contributes to a sense of wholeness. So my approach, the McWilliam method, consists of cognitive reframing, body activation, and creative expression, arts-based experientials. That is because without the creative energy is what makes you godly, right? Your capacity to create is what inspires your ability to be seated in the essence of your spirit. So if you could imagine that the mind is like the gas at the gas station and the body is the car, right? The frame of the car. Then your creative life force energy is the hose that connects the gas to the car. Okay. So once we tap into that, that is when we start to really become the true manifestors of our lives and our reality. Okay. So this emotional differentiation, or fears about it's really usually more about, it's less about wanting to be emotionally differentiated, and it's more about being afraid of what happens if I differentiate myself from this person. What happens if I step into the essence of my being as an autonomous creature, right? Because if your experience of relationships is enmeshed or merged, when you start to individuate, it's going to feel like abandonment. Either you feel like you're abandoning someone else, or they feel, or you feel like they're abandoning you, right? So you might start by recognizing what are the unconscious myths that are pulling your strings, and start to challenge them. And that's going to break down the barriers that you have to really fully inhabiting your more autonomous self. And that's going to put you in greater contact with the essence of your spirit. So I want to share maybe 3 myths that people with this conundrum might harbor, and then let's play with some affirmations to counter them. So the first one is usually, if I emotionally separate from my partner, then it means that I don't love them or I don't value our connection. So this myth can kind of lead to a loss of self, right? A self-sacrificing attitude, because you feel the need to completely merge with your partner emotionally in order to reassure that you love them, or to convince yourself that you love them, right? Or that you are loved. So here's an affirmation to sort of counter that. I can hold my own emotions and still deeply love and connect with my partner. In fact, my individuality enhances our relationship, right? Because it makes room for them to show up in their fullness, and it makes room for you to show up in your fullness. And now you actually know each other. You're not strategizing in this suffocated space, not stepping on each other's toes, trying to figure out, how can I not step on their toes? How can I find free space? You both have your own oxygen tanks, so you both get to dive really deep, right? Now, the second one, my partner's happiness is my responsibility and their unhappiness is my failure. So this belief can foster that kind of codependent pattern where your self-worth is deeply entangled with your partner's emotional state. Now, a lot of people tend to think, well, secure people take responsibility for their partner's happiness. No, secure people have an investment in contributing to their partner's happiness. They want to be a participant in it. They don't want to be fully responsible for it. Okay. So here's an affirmation. I care for my partner's happiness, but I recognize it's not my sole responsibility. I can be a supportive contributor without losing myself or taking on too much. Right. And the last one, if I set emotional boundaries, it means I'm cold and unresponsive. So this misconception could discourage you from trying to establish healthy emotional boundaries, making you susceptible to things like manipulation or control, right? Or susceptible to things like gaslighting, okay? So if you refuse to set a boundary, then anybody can kind of persuade you to do anything. So here's an affirmation for this. Here's an affirmation for this. Setting emotional boundaries is an act of self-respect, self-advocacy, and self-love. It enables me to be fully present and authentic in my relationship. Okay. Now, I recommend you might take these affirmations and statements, and I would use them with repetition. I personally am certified in EFT tapping, like tapping different tapping points through the meridians in the body. So I would recite these affirmations and I would tap through them so that you can start to shift the energy around those deeply unconscious and embedded beliefs. Okay. Just allow them to become like your new template and a filter for experiencing your relationships and also conceptualizing your relationship to a partner. And so that process is going to allow you to cultivate a relationship that is rich and that is fulfilling without losing yourself in it. Okay. It's going to ground you in your own emotional reality. So you're not cutting off connection. Instead, you are enhancing it. Right. So I hope that helps answer that question. So we have time probably for one more, and then the ones that we don't get to, I will pick up in the next live stream that we do. From what does stems that we give so much power to others because of very authoritarian parents? How do we step into the essence of our being? So that's a longer question. That's a more in-depth question. How do we step into the essence of our being? How do we create those transcendent experiences so that we can connect with the essence of our being? Well, first, by normalizing it, realizing it's not something that just happens once or twice at an ashram or when you went and did that psychedelic retreat. Like, you can connect to the essence of your spirit every morning when you wake up. and you create ritualistic practices around that. My Hungry Love Masterclass program walks you through, it's a 6-month program that walks you through my proprietary framework for how we do this, how we can connect to the transcendent in very normal and regular and routine everyday ways. And the 4 steps for that are simply clarifying desire. Then we look at releasing the root pain, meaning the embodied and constricted energy around the fears that come up when we name our desires. Then we look at reframing our beliefs. So this means looking at what are the beliefs that perpetuate those constrictions. It's not enough just to do embodied work because your mind is still constructed in the way that it's constructed. So we have to reprogram the body and we have to reprogram the mind. And we use creative processes in order to connect the two so that they're in constant conversation, so that when we make a shift, that energy moves. And the last step, we're able to install new patterns. So we install new beliefs, we install new energy patterns, we move the body in different ways so that the nervous system and your limbic brain and the way that your cell memory and the way that you respond to things becomes more fluid, more flexible, more soft, more receptive, at the same time, more focused, more directed, more motivated, inspired, organized, and so on. We have a balance in our chakra system and in our energy body as a whole. And I do have one more question, and actually this one was for you, Lucia. You had a question. Okay, looking at this from an attachment perspective, my client, a therapist, doesn't say anything when I hurt myself. For example, I fell on my knees the other day. I asked, where is some kindness? And he said, well, it already happened. When we talk about this, his opinion is that he doesn't need to say anything. I said, well, what if I would like some kindness? And he says he does the same thing to himself. There's no use to connect an emotion to physical harm. How can I respond? I'm worried that he won't show empathy for others and that affects relationships. Okay, so you physically hurt yourself and this person did not acknowledge it. And when you maybe pointed out that through normal social interactions, it's a benefit for someone to acknowledge your physical pain and to express some empathy. But this person said that there's no point in connecting emotions to physical well-being. So this tells me this person's probably been physically abused, or at least experienced severe disconnect from the emotional body and the physical body. And so there's a dissociative quality going on here. So one way to respond to that is to say, well, that's interesting. Is there a point to connect pleasure with physical, is there a point in connecting joy with physical pleasure? I'm going to guess they're probably going to say no, because they have a strong protective part in operation. Whatever they suffered physically has convinced them that the benefits of being a dynamic and emotionally expressive person that is fully seated in their body, whatever the benefits of that are, and there are many, is not worth the pain. So that tells me this person has had and experienced a tremendous amount of pain, and maybe even to the point where it's affected the mirror neurons in their brain. So I don't know enough to say more than that. I would also worry they may struggle to show empathy for others because there's a strong protective part of them that hasn't seen the value in understanding a connection between mind and body, right? Emotional well-being and physical well-being. So that's kind of getting the person to be embodied is probably where my treatment would begin. And that would begin with what allows them to access their life force energy, what allows them to experience pleasure. So we would start with pleasure, not pain. And we would want to create an appetite for it. And so that's what I would recommend. You want to create an appetite for pleasure. And when they start to experience pleasure, their body will turn on. And then you will have a whole new ball of wax where they're going to freak out. And all this stuff's going to come up and they're going to hate you for it. And the original trauma will be alive and well. And then you get to lean in, and that's when you'll start to see real movement happen. If they can write it up. So I hope that that helps. So with that, we are at the end of our time here. We still have a couple more questions to go. I will come back and we'll do more question and answer the next time we pop in to do a live stream, which might do one more time this month. I mean, I am going on vacation the second half of the month, so we'll see how it pans out. But I will save these questions and we'll make sure to address them the next time we go live. Thank you, everybody, for joining me here. I appreciate your participation, especially for those of you that have joined me live. What about people who've suffered so much that their brain is damaged in some ways, their hope for reversal? I would recommend checking out the work of Dr. Amen. He wrote a book called Change Your Brain, Change Your Life. He does a lot of work with NFL players who experience significant damage, particularly in their temporal lobes and their prefrontal cortex. And so he has works with SPECT scan imagery, and he has done treatment regimens with folks that experience severe brain damage, and they have seen significant recovery. So I would recommend checking out the work of Dr. Amen. I think he used to have a show on PBS. He's my old boss. Thank you for your answers and insights. Pleasure and appetite. Yes, we work with music and he feels safe with music. Oh, for sure. Yeah, then keep going. Dr. Amen, like amen, right? Change your brain, change your life. Doctor, yes, exactly. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I hope that you have a wonderful day and that you enjoy your weekend to come.